Welcome to episode 16 of Successful Demo. In this episode, we analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of more newly released cards. What did you think of this card when it was first spoiled? Do leave your comments in the comment section. I would actually love to hear what you have to say about this card. This is a new HB identity, and what I love about it is its elegant design. It has a rather simple plain ability, yet there are so many underlying subtleties, which we'll discuss in great detail in the next few slides. So my initial evaluation when I first saw this card is, well, obviously this is the core equivalent of Haley, the runner identity. It compresses your clicks by allowing you to install 2 cards with a click instead of 1. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, this does not allow you to install a card in a new server. It forces you to install in the same server. Now, this would be a really powerful asset spam identity if you could just build horizontally. Can you imagine the sort of asset spam that this sort of ability would enable? Thankfully or unthankfully, whichever you desire, this is not the case, so it is a lot harder to play asset spam with this. Because obviously you cannot install 2 assets with Arsa's ability. Well, technically you can, but you have to trash one of them. The big question is, can Arsa fire as often as Haley's ability? This is an interesting question because even if you build your deck such that it will fire as much as possible, you have to consider that the probability of firing it on different servers is uneven. Central servers, for example, are very unlikely to use Arsa's ability, especially when you consider the typical turn 1, something like an Ice hedge fund, Ice on R&D, Ice on HQ hedge fund. You have very little reason to play double Ice on a single server on turn 1, right? So that is already a missed opportunity for an Arsa trigger. And if you do open with 1 Ice on each key central, how are you going to get Arsa to fire on subsequent turns? You would have to build the second and third Ice on HQ or R&D in the same turn using a click. That is expensive and in most games unwarranted. There's not many situations where you would need 3 or more Ice on the central. So because of this, Arsa is typically only going to fire on remotes for the most part. So it's very difficult to actually get as many triggers as you would like, whereas Haley doesn't have this restriction. Your ability is relevant throughout the entire game for whichever type of card that you build your deck towards, be it resources or hardware or programs. So yeah, that is something to think about. And when you think about setting up your board state, whether you build Ice or assets, there's actually a very interesting and perhaps mind-blowing realization that I come to. If you look at this board state, for example, you'll notice that the corp side board state extends into 3 dimensions. You have the horizontal axis, which is typically associated with the expansion of assets. So if you're playing lots of assets in new servers, you're expanding horizontally. If you're an Ice-based deck that is stacking Ice on the same server, you're expanding vertically. And if your deck somehow runs a lot of upgrades that are stacked on the same server, you're running on the depth axis. So the corp side board is actually a 3-dimensional board state, which is pretty 3-dimensional space, I should say, which is a pretty crazy realization. And noticing this is actually very important when building your Arsa deck, because you have to decide which axis you want to focus on. Typically, a good Arsa deck would focus on 1 or 2 of these axes, just like how a good Haley deck would focus on only 1 or 2 of the types, something like a resource and program based Haley. This is so that you can maximize your triggers. Otherwise, if you draw a bunch of, if you have 1 hardware, 1 resource, and 1 program in your hand, for example, you will not be able to trigger Haley. Similarly with Arsa, it's going to be very hard to get Arsa to trigger if you don't have enough Ice in your deck, for example, so you can't build vertically, or if you don't have enough upgrades in your deck, so you cannot build along the depth axis. So with that said, one good way in which you can build Arsa is to concentrate on the vertical axis, which is Ice, and the depth axis, which corresponds to upgrades. So you focus on stacking Ice and upgrades in a single remote, keeping in mind that you can actually install cards of different types with Arsa. You can install Batty and trigger it to install Titanium, or vice versa. This way you can build your defenses vertically and on the depth axis at the same time, And there's two ways to do this. This now comes down to the mechanics, your win condition basically. You could go down to the fast advanced route using cards such as Calibration Testing and Breakaway Grid as upgrades in your remote, or you can go the Glacier route using the standard defensive upgrades such as Marcus Beatty and Ash. So these are pretty good options, but spoiler alert, we are not going to do this because I will explain the reason why. Instead, I'm going to look at two different axes. I'm going to be expanding horizontally and vertically, assets and ice. What am I doing playing asset spam in Asa? Well, think of it this way. Imagine if you get to install, instead of installing a bunch of assets protected by 0 ice, why not install a bunch of assets protected by 1 ice? After all, HB does not have a defensive ID ability that protects assets like CTM or Gagarin or IG, but with Asa, you can protect your assets using ice, and that slows down the runner because they are forced to pay through the ice. You're using cheap ice like Naja 1.0 or Fair Children, and you're just protecting your assets and making them harder to trash by imposing the ice tax. So it's basically Gagarin's ability or IG's ability, except that instead of paying an extra credit or two, they are paying whatever it takes to break the ice, be it clicks, credits, or breakers, or whatever. So this seems like the way to go with Asa right now. And if they run one of your servers to trash the asset in there, which is giving you a huge advantage in the game, well, you just stack more assets, nastier assets, and nastier ice on the same server. This is asset spam at its finest. Not only are your assets well protected, they are basically, very hard to trash, so the runner does not have an incentive to trash them, which means you can start sneaking agendas out on the board. So this is why I think this is a better route to go than the upgrade route, which is in which you find it harder to sneak agendas out. Typically, runners won't check face down cards like the one you see here, which gives you the advantage of sneaking agendas on the table, which is important against clock based decks. And it's also important in a post-Jackson world. One reason why Food Code's Glacier deck was so viable in the past was that Jackson Howard existed, so you can shuffle agendas back into your deck. With that ability gone, it is increasingly important to be able to get rid of your agendas, and you can do that much more easily with asset spam based deck rather than a vertical deck, because you can't install two agendas in the same server, and typically you don't really want to score your agendas early. You would rather leave them on the board, the runner doesn't run them, you score them at a later time while you're busy spending the early turn setting up your board state. That is what you want. It is also important to note that in the current meta game up to Sovereign Sight, assets are generally more powerful and have a critical mass, as opposed to upgrades which are weaker and perhaps have more counters or are just not that powerful. With the loss of Caprice Nisei, the upgrade strategy just doesn't look that good nowadays. Whereas with assets, you have powerful and hard to trash assets like MC Austerity, G's Motobaroids, all these that directly feed into your win condition. I hate to say it, but asset spam just seems better and more natural. So that's what we're going to build, and this is the deck. This looks like a very standard asset spam HB deck, and you really cannot go wrong playing all of these cards. This is just the most powerful win condition in HB right now. Some interesting cards to note. Public Support and MC Austerity support your win condition by allowing you to... for MC Austerity, it allows you to score your 3-pointer in Ikawa Project. For Public Support, it allows you to win the game without scoring your 3-pointer. You just need to score 3 2-pointers and a Public Support. That gets you up to 7 points. G's Motobaroids enables you to score Sales Team off the table, which is very important, as Sales Team is actually a rather integral economy component in your deck. This deck runs pretty poor at times. Now we'll spend the next couple of minutes talking about synergistic cards that you'll see more often than not in Asa decks. Hopefully this will help you better understand how you can maximize the efficiency and use of Asa's ability, as well as perhaps help you in building your own Asa deck. So, Advanced Assembly Lines. This is a very natural fit in Asa group. Obviously, it allows you to trigger Asa on the runner's turn in addition to your own turn. Obviously, getting more Asa triggers means that you're getting more mileage out of your ability, which is always a good thing since your ability makes you efficient. It's like getting Clone Chip or SMC triggers on the corpse turn as Haley. So that's pretty cool. Rules nitpick here is that neither of these cards allow you to install agendas on the runner's turn. Meaning that even in combination, you cannot install agendas on the runner's turn. Whether you use advanced assembly lines to install agendas, which is not allowed, or use advanced assembly lines to install an ICE, which then triggers ASA to allow you to install agendas, that's not allowed either. Neither card allows you to install agendas. So this is not a win con, but it is a very efficient card in ASA. What about Ultraviolet Clearance? Another natural fit, probably the second best identity to use Ultraviolet in after Cerebral Imaging, obviously. This allows you to install 2 cards instead of 1 with Ultraviolet's final ability of installing a card, which reduces the need for you to discard at the end of your turn. Typically, that's a problem with Ultraviolet. You're flooded with cards, you're forced to discard useful cards, and leave agenda HQ more dense with agendas. It's also important to note that Ultraviolet draws you more cards because this fuels your installs on future turns. If you have ever played Haley, one of the biggest problems you might run into is that your deck doesn't have enough draw, and as a result you're not drawing pairs of cards of the same type often enough. Same thing with Asa. You might not draw, Ice and Asset in the same hand, so Ultraviolet helps you get there faster, which is pretty important. It also makes your deck faster, which is useful if you're playing a deck that wants to score quickly. Defensive upgrades are important for Asa as well. They give you a reason to trigger Asa on centrals. Otherwise, you are looking to stack 2 ice on centrals, which is a very rare occurrence. Now, a rules nitpick here is that you cannot install upgrades on centrals using Asa's ability. So installing Crisium and then triggering Asa to install an ICE on the same server is okay. However, installing an ICE on R&D and then attempting to trigger Asa on Crisium is not okay. This is because upgrades on centrals are installed in the root of the central. The root of a central is not considered to be in the server. In keyword here for Netrunner rules. So this is a very wonky a rules quirk, and I don't personally like the rules quirk myself, but it is what it is. As of the time of this recording, the root is not considered to be in the server, and as a direct result, you cannot install Crisium using Asa's ability. Now obviously in most cases this doesn't matter, you simply install the Crisium before the ice, but it could matter in situations such as using team sponsorship. If you are trying to install, an ice for free using team sponsorship's ability, you are not able to install an upgrade on the central after that with Asa's ability. Now, I want to also talk about counter currents. These are actually really essential in Asa, no matter which build you're going for, be it the vertical build or the horizontal build. Whichever variant you're playing, you're inevitably going to play a lot of upgrades and possibly a lot of assets as well. And losing your identity ability sucks. Losing efficiency sucks. But the bigger concern is not so much Employee Strike, which disables your identity. It's Hacktivist. Hacktivist just completely shuts you down because you cannot make use of the many upgrades and assets that you have installed. And this is a very big problem. Not to mention that HB does not have a viable 2-1 agenda right now to clear enemy currents. So realistically, your only good option is scarcity of resources, which is why I think this is one of the more essential cards in your deck. Otherwise, you'll just completely fold to any Hacktivist deck and you will struggle to play against any Employee Strike deck. Now, I also want to talk about Calibration Testing, even though this is not in the deck that I'm about to showcase. I think many of you will attempt to play a Breakaway Grid Cali Testing deck. This is a very good combo for those of you who haven't realized. Cali Testing plus Asa equals Biotic Labor. Imagine a turn where you have Project Vitruvius and Cali Testing in your hand. Click 1, install both cards using Asa's ability. Clicks 2 and 3, double advance the Vitruvius, and use Cali Testing to add the third counter onto Vitruvius, scoring it. So it's a pseudo Biotic Labor, allowing to score a Vitruvius from hand. And it's only the upside is that it costs 1 less credit than Biotic Labor, and the other upside is that it synergizes with Breakaway Grid, potentially allowing you to fast advance, only requiring 2 credits on the start of your turn. That's pretty nuts. The bad news is this costs 3 influence per Cali Testing, and it's trashable. It has a 2 trash costs. But, well, it's an interesting card to play with. We won't be showcasing it today. Instead, let's go Asset Spam! Alright, I want to spend some time discussing my opening strategy. I have this opening hand which is pretty mediocre, no money, but I want to punish my opponent for playing Ayla, which tends to be a slow deck that wants to spend the first few turns setting up and clicking cards off her NV RAM. So I'm going to keep this hand and I'm going to place MCA austerity policy pressure from turn 1. This is because I have the MCA in hand as well as the perfect piece of ice to defend it in the Architect, which costs exactly 4 credits, which allows me to res it, and then create a lose-lose situation for my opponent where if they run it, they'll give me an Architect Fire, which will allow me to start spamming horizontally, or they will let me have MCA, which forces clicks away from them. Now, I make a rookie mistake here because I'm so used to icing R&D first thing in the morning. You ice... Sorry, you install your remote first because you're ASA, allowing you to trigger off the remote. On my second click, I click the MCA, and then with the third click, I ice R&D. So ordering is important here. ASA is very finicky that way. You'll notice that my R&D ice does absolutely nothing, and that's fine. It's only there to deter R&D runs, or rather indexings, Maker's Eyes and stuff, which they might have. The news hound that's on R&D now is completely blank, right? It doesn't have an ender run subroutine, it gives a tag which is rather irrelevant, but all you need is the deterrence from running R&D. So even if it were a blank ice, I would have put it there turn 1 just to prevent them from indexing early. And that worked out. So my opponent's not running R&D, they're certainly not running my austerity policy, and as a result, they are losing very valuable clicks, while I can start threatening with an agenda score next turn. I will be looking to score the Ikawa from my hand. I'm going greedy here with all 3 counters because this deck has a pretty big problem with scoring the 5-3. So if I can get it out of circulation, that would be fantastic. And it seems like my opponent is going to concede the 5-3 to me, so I'm going to happily score it here. Nope, I'm not. I'm going to play the Ultraviolet first because it was in my hand. If I scored the Ikawa there, I'll go down to 1 credit, leaving me vulnerable to indexing, Maker's Eye, and I won't be able to play the Ultraviolet clearance for a long time. I will have to click up for a lot of credits. This is why I play the Ultraviolet first, seeing that my opponent isn't interested in contesting my MC Austerity at this time. And I also install a card here and dump an agenda in the bin. I find that I'm rather agenda flooded at this point, and knowing how most Ayla decks are constructed, I think it's okay to leave agendas in the bin. So I'm going to start my turn. Now I'm thinking of whether to use the G-Smarter Bioroids to score my Ikawa project. There's no clock threat, so this Ikawa is free. The question is whether I want to get an extra click, and the answer is yes, obviously. An extra click's always nice. So we are going to install Quintuple Advance. Minor mistake here, I should have played the Hedge Fund before going through with these advancements, because now I'm at a point where I cannot play the Hedge Fund. So yeah, gameplay mistake there. Take note of that. Ordering is very important. This deck has so many finicky moving components and it's so easy to misplay. In hindsight, I can see my mistakes now. My opponent slowly but surely setting up with Velasco and Mopus, which is very curious. You almost never want to play both in the same deck. I'm not sure what my opponent's going for here, but given the deck deals, you can expect that there are going to be Savants running about. So I need to reevaluate the strengths of all my ice. Code gates are suddenly a lot less good, but sentries might be better. And what is this sorcery? What is this? Wireless Net Pavilion? Question mark? I mean, it's Data League Reversal has cycled, so what? What? I do not know what to expect here. Sure, I could trash the Velasco and that probably hoses my opponent, but I really want to play this Hedge Fund in my hand, so I'm going to play the Hedge Fund in my hand. Also, I think that it's better for me to rush out here rather than trying to disrupt my opponent, because even if I disrupt the Velasco, I can't disrupt the Mopus, and they'll become pretty invincible with a Mopus Paperclip Savant suite towards the end. So here I'm just going to set up my server and attempt to score out my sales team to put me at match point. My opponent gets Beth down, which is okay. Usually I like to store credits, but in this situation I'm just rushing out, so I don't really care about my credit level. Instead, I'm just going to stash all my credits on this corporate sales team, which will slowly drip in the money for me. So I'm on match point, my opponent hasn't a single breaker set up, so I should be winning this, right? Well, let's see what sort of shenanigans comes my way. It's turn 7, it's pretty late, but late is better than never. My opponent finally has the time and money to install their Savant. So here we go, and I start realizing that this is actually this actually spells doom for my deck. My ice is powerful because it's both high strength and high in subroutines, but Savant just completely waltzes by that. You don't need to pump strength to match my fair children. And at a rate of 2 credits for 2 code gate subroutines, it's pretty easy to break stuff with Savant. So yeah, my ice is suddenly looking a lot worse, which means that it's gonna be harder than I imagined to score out the final agenda. It seems like I have to start doing jammy mind games with my opponent by installing a bunch of assets and making them run every one of my remotes if I want to stand a chance. Because with the Magnum Opus economy, I will get eclipsed very quickly. And I play the scarcity here to activate my News Hounds. I have a couple of News Hounds on R&D, and I would like them to have strength. You will also notice that I place News Hound as the ice on R&D because that's the most taxing, while being the cheapest to res. And you also notice I installed with Arsa's ability Chrysium Grid on R&D. I made the mistake there of installing the ice before Chrysium when I should be installing the Chrysium before the ice, as we mentioned in the finicky rules earlier, rules interactions. Okay. So you'll notice that I did not hyper draw and then install agenda on my previous turn. Again, because my opponent can easily run my remote with Savant and there's 17 credits. So at this point, I need to basically hoard a bunch of assets and then spam them out and hope my opponent doesn't check the agenda. Yes. So my opponent installed Paparazzi there, and then that is where I started deducing what my opponent was actually going for. The Paparazzi tells me they don't want to take meat damage, and the card that deals them a lot of meat damage is none other than, yep, you guessed it, there it is. They are playing, what do you call it? By Any Means, the new Anarch card, into Deep Data Mining. Props to my opponent for coming up with this idea. This is such a cool combo. It's such a pity though because their deck has Hyperdriver in it. Imagine if they pulled off By Any Means on a 7-click turn. That would be insane. Anyway, By Any Means is pretty cool because against asset spam deck like mine, they can simply run the remotes and trash all my assets, which is really crippling. I don't want to lose my Jeeves here. But instead, they're just going to laser focus on R&D, and unfortunately, I have very bad news for my opponent. That's exactly why I play Chrysium Grid in this deck. The deep data mining was spotted. The only solace they get is that they trash the Chrysium Grid for free. And that cost me 3 to res. But sure enough, my opponent was ready with the second data mining. So if I didn't have the Chrysium Grid there, the benefit of By Any Means is that my opponent would actually be able to plow through 10 of my cards in R&D and send everything into the bin. And yes, you cannot steal agendas during the run. You are forced to trash them, so they all go into the bin. As you saw, 2 agendas were milled, so I have 4 agenda points in the bin. Uh-oh. I need to seal up that archives, huh? Okay. What's my best line of play here? I thought about this for a while. You can pause the video here and ask yourself what you'd do in this situation. So my first click here was a draw. I knew that my deck had absolutely no way of recurring stuff from the bin except for the lone team sponsorship. Which is pretty useless because if the next time I score an agenda, I would win the game anyway since I'm on match point. So really my focus isn't on keeping the runner out of archives. That won't happen. They will get in sooner or later. Rather my focus is on scoring the final agenda, which I look like I'm trying to do here. I actually am. It's a public support behind the Architect here, and my goal is to win on double public support. Each one gives 1 agenda point. Combined with the 5 agenda points I have now, I will win. So that's going to be my out. And my opponent thinks this is an agenda. They are going to be really disappointed here. And Architect is going to force them to pay credits because you really don't want to let Architect fire against asset spam. So they disappointingly hit the public support with no money to trash it. So here I res the public support, and this puts a ticking time bomb on my opponent's head. They need to contest the public supports, otherwise they will lose in 2 turns. The problem is, the other public support, the unprotected one, is very easy to contest. All they have to do is Mopus, hit Magnum Opus a couple of times and run it. So I need to stop them from doing that, and to do so I need to put some ice on that remote. I only have Fetch Out 3 and Ravana in my hand, and Fetch Out 3 is way out of my reach right now. It's too expensive, so it has to be the Ravana that goes on that remote. At least force my opponent to pay a couple of clicks or credits to get through, even though it's so easily breakable by Savant. Also keep in mind that the cards on top of R&D right now are fresh. Even though my opponent used deep data mining not too long ago, because of By Any Means, all the cards that they saw went into my archives, meaning that the cards on top of R&D are new. This means that I can potentially top deck some agendas as I continue my turns. And for my opponent, this means that R&D is still a viable route to victory, especially if they have another deep data mining ready to go. So my opponent goes for a power turn here, sacrificing the hyperdriver for some big 7-click turn action. Well, most of it was actually spent hitting Magnum Opus. They were pretty poor, they needed some cards, they started drawing, and for the last click they played Riptile? What? Well, I guess they really wanted to recur their deep data mining or their By Any Means. Even though they can only recur one card, it's going to be enough for a very powerful next turn. So that is something I'm very wary of. I thought about it for a while more, and I decided to let them have it because last turn I snuck a Vitruvius on the table that would win me the game anyway. Taking advantage of my opponent's passive play against my undefended remotes, my sneaky Vitruvius pulled out the win for me. You know, forget about Asa Group. That was not an interesting demonstration at all. Even though my opponent lost, they were the star of the show. They had the successful demo. Even though they didn't win, they made such a cool combo that I never even considered. Sure, By Any Means into Paparazzi seems natural, but they combined it with some of the best cards that synergize very well with By Any Means. Deep data mining for maximum mileage out of By Any Means, and hyperdriver to get as many clicks as possible to just trash your opponent's deck all the way. That's what I love, and this is why I play Netrunner. This is why experimenting with cards is so much fun, and not just blind experimenting, mind you. My opponent had purpose, they had direction, they knew what they were doing, and even though they didn't really successfully pull off their strategy in terms of bringing them the 7 agenda points needed to win, that was a successful experimentation in my opinion. It's not just about playing your own deck solitarily. This is a two-player game. I play this game to interact with people and to exchange ideas with the best of the best. And what my opponent played, they inspired me to come up with a successful demo of By Any Means for myself. So props to my opponent, because this is what constitutes success, inspiring other people to follow in your footsteps. So with that said, screw Asa Group. Instead, welcome to episode 17 of Successful Demo. In each episode, we analyze the theoretical and practical aspects of one new lead release cards.